Beneath them, Lady Aurelia Harbury moved with the quiet command of a woman born to reign. Her gown of dove-gray satin rippled as she passed, softer than moonlight, more precise than any glance that followed her. To watch her was to believe in perfection. To envy her was to feel almost righteous. And so London did both. But perfection in Regency England was a fragile crown. One rumor could fracture it like porcelain. That evening, it came not as a whisper but a declaration. A folded letter slipped into the gloved hand of a duchess. Within it, proof, or so it seemed, of Aurelia's secret tryst with a married viscount. By the time the orchestra swelled again, her name was already on a dozen tongues, each retelling painted darker than the last. When she turned, the crowd had thinned around her. Conversations broke like glass. No one would meet her eye. She saw laughter strangled behind fans, gentlemen bowing not to greet but to avoid. And then she saw her mother's face, white, rigid, a single glance that said, ruined. In truth, Aurelia had never met the Viscount alone, had never written the letter they now claimed was hers. Yet innocence was no armor against scandal. Only wealth and men's indifference could save a woman, and she had already lost the first and the second was crumbling. The morning after, the Harbury townhouse became a prison of whispers. Her father refused her audience. Her brother, red-faced with shame, spat that she had shamed the bloodline. "Do you not see what you've cost us?" he thundered. "The Lord Chancellor himself insists on action. Reputation must be cleansed by consequence." It was then that they pronounced the sentence that would seal her exile. She was to wed Thomas Lynden, a land steward from the countryside, the son of a man who had once managed their estate with rustic loyalty. His virtue, her father declared, would redeem her disgrace. Her rank would be stripped, her dowry forfeit. A duchess must learn humility, he said, even if it must be taught by calloused hands. Aurelia said nothing. The words struck not as punishment but as prophecy. She would become a lesson whispered among debutantes, how pride leads to ruin, how beauty fades when soiled by rumor. The wedding was arranged within a week. No orchestra, no crowd, no procession of lace and silver. Only a chapel heavy with candle smoke, 2 witnesses paid to attend, and a vicar who avoided her gaze. Thomas Lynden stood before her, tall, broad-shouldered, his face worn by labor and sun. His coat was simple, his eyes neither deferent nor bold. He seemed as bewildered as she was, as though fate had stitched them together in error. When he spoke his vows, his voice trembled once, only once, but it was not fear, she thought. It was pity. Aurelia's gloved hands barely touched his. Her "I do" was a whisper smothered by silence. No one clapped. The vicar closed the book and cleared his throat as if sealing a transaction. Outside, rain fell like a slow applause from heaven. The carriage that waited was unadorned, its wheels caked with mud. Thomas offered his hand to help her inside. She hesitated, then accepted. The gesture was simple, but his touch was warm, steady, jarringly human in a day of empty ceremony. They rode in silence through the narrow London streets, past gas lamps flickering in the mist, past faceless onlookers who might have known her once. Inside the carriage, the air was thick with the scent of rain and horse leather. Aurelia kept her gaze fixed on the window, watching her city blur into shadow. She had been taught all her life to speak with poise, to smile through insult, to never allow her heart to show. But the rhythm of the wheels on the wet cobblestones loosened something inside her. At last she said quietly, "You need not play the devoted husband, Mr. Lynden. I understand this marriage serves only others." Thomas turned his head, his expression unreadable. "My lady," he said, "I serve no one's pride. Not even theirs." The words caught her off guard, too honest, too calm. He did not look at her with resentment or triumph, only with the unflinching steadiness of a man who had seen hardship and chosen gentleness anyway. Hours passed. London fell away, replaced by the rolling silence of the countryside. The world outside turned gray and green, threaded with hedgerows and fog. Aurelia's reflection in the window looked like that of a stranger, pale, stripped of jewels, her eyes hollow where defiance had lived. She thought of the ballroom, the gold, the light, the rustle of envy disguised as admiration. How swiftly all of it had burned to ash. She thought of the Lord Chancellor's verdict. A duchess must learn humility. Yet even in disgrace, pride clung to her like perfume. It was all she had left of herself. Thomas broke the silence only once more. "It will not be as you are used to," he said softly, eyes still on the road. "My home is small. But I will treat you with respect." Respect. The word struck deeper than pity. It was the first kindness she had been offered since the scandal began. She wanted to thank him, but the syllables died on her tongue. The road narrowed as dusk fell. Lamps flickered in cottage windows, so humble, so foreign to her that she almost laughed. How cruelly the world could shrink. And yet, the scent of wet earth, the distant sound of a nightingale, it stirred something nameless inside her, something that hurt less than bitterness. Thomas slowed the horses. "We are nearly there," he said. Ahead, a small stone cottage stood by a field, its roof glistening with rain. A faint light glowed in the window, warm, unpretentious, impossibly far from the marble halls of London. Aurelia stepped down, the hem of her gown dragging through the mud. Her slipper sank into the earth. She looked up at the cottage, then at the man who was now her husband. "You may hate me for this," she murmured. Thomas shook his head. "I could never hate what I pity," he said, then paused as though the words had gone too far. "Nor what I respect." The rain softened to a mist. The air smelled of wood smoke and coming spring. For the first time in weeks, Aurelia's chest eased, not with comfort, but with exhaustion that felt almost merciful. She turned once more to the dark horizon, where the faint glow of London was still visible, distant, unreachable, fading like a cruel star. "I did not do this," she whispered, voice trembling. Thomas's hand tightened briefly on the reins. He did not look at her, yet his voice carried through the rain, quiet but sure. "I know," he said. The carriage wheels creaked to rest beside the gate. Inside the cottage, a single candle burned. And as its light flickered against the window, Aurelia understood that whatever awaited her here, humility, obscurity, perhaps even a strange kind of peace, her life as she had known it was gone forever. The rain stopped. The silence that followed was not empty, but waiting. The first morning in the cottage arrived pale and undecided, its light filtering through uncurtained windows as though uncertain whether it belonged there. The air smelled of damp wood and faint lavender, the remnants, Thomas explained quietly, of his mother's linen chest. Aurelia rose from a narrow bed and stared at the rough plaster walls that enclosed her new life. Gone were the embroidered draperies, the marbled hearths, the soft murmur of servants who knew their place. Here there was only silence, broken by the soft creak of the house itself, as if it too were curious about its new inhabitant. Thomas had left early before dawn to attend to his fields. He had set a small loaf of bread and a jar of honey on the table, and beside them a note written in careful, unpracticed script. "For your breakfast. The bees are friendly if you walk beyond the hedge." The gesture struck her as both absurd and strangely intimate. A duchess reduced to bees and bread, how the world must be laughing. She folded the note and pressed it flat beneath her palm, unsure whether to burn it or keep it. Outside, the countryside unfolded with a kind of reckless beauty, fields veiled in mist, hedgerows jeweled with dew, the distant hum of life not meant to impress but to endure. Villagers glanced up as she passed, their expressions a mixture of awe and pity. A fallen duchess was a tale too delicious not to share, and yet too tragic to mock openly. When a little girl curtsied clumsily, Aurelia inclined her head in return. The child's mother tugged her away, whispering something Aurelia didn't need to hear aloud. She had heard the same tone in London drawing rooms. Disgrace carried its own perfume. People recognized it before they recognized the face that wore it. By afternoon, Thomas returned, his boots muddied and his sleeves rolled. He looked every inch the laborer her family had meant her to despise. Yet when he spoke, there was a measured courtesy in his manner that unsettled her more than any roughness could have. "You needn't stand when I enter, my lady," he said, setting down a sack of feed. "This house has few customs worth keeping." "I rise for no man's command," she replied coolly, though her voice lacked its former authority. His mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Then rise for your own." The remark lingered long after he left the room, hovering like smoke. That night she found herself watching him through the window as he repaired a fence by lantern light, his movements steady, unhurried. He did not glance toward the house, did not seem aware of being observed, and yet there was something almost reverent in the way he touched the earth, as though tending to it were a kind of prayer. The next day he presented her with a small book bound in worn leather. "My mother's," he said. "Recipes and a few notes on herbs. You might find comfort in small things." Aurelia accepted it with the distant politeness of someone handed a relic from a foreign faith. "Thank you, Mr. Lynden. I have little interest in domestic rituals." "Then let it rest," he said simply, and left her to decide. She placed it on the mantel, but that night, unable to sleep, she opened it. The first page bore a pressed sprig of rosemary and the inscription, "For remembrance." Her throat tightened unexpectedly. Days unfolded in quiet repetition. Thomas spoke little, but his silences were never cold. He left room for her pride to breathe, even as that pride began to feel like a heavy garment in summer heat. The villager's curiosity grew bolder. A merchant's wife stopped her in the market to ask, with feigned innocence, if she missed London's luxuries. "I imagine exile must be dreadful," she said too sweetly. Aurelia managed a smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Only to those who have never earned it." Still, humiliation found its cracks. One afternoon, while purchasing candles, she heard two men muttering near the doorway. "Poor fellow," one said, meaning Thomas. "To be saddled with a proud sinner." The other snorted. "He'll tame her soon enough, or she'll run back to her marble halls." They laughed. Aurelia left the shop without a word, her hands trembling. She had been a duchess all her life. She had not known until now what it meant to have no defense but silence. That evening she found Thomas on the porch sharpening a blade. The dying sun gilded the edges of his hair, the air thick with the scent of oil and steel. "The villagers talk," she said, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "They will," he answered, "until they find a new subject." "You do not care what they say?" He looked up then, meeting her gaze. "Care? Yes. But not enough to let it govern me." His calmness disarmed her more thoroughly than any apology. "You are strange, Mr. Lynden. I have been called worse." For a long moment neither spoke. Then he said, more softly, "If they wrong you, I will not stay silent." She almost laughed. A steward defending a duchess? That would make a fine jest at the tavern. It would make a finer truth. The words fell between them like a spark. She turned away, but that night, when she looked from her window, she saw a small pressed flower resting on the sill, forget-me-not, bright against the dusk. Beneath it, a note, for hope should you wish it. She closed her fingers around it, then held it too long before setting it aside. A week later, an unexpected carriage appeared in the lane, a polished, lacquered thing out of place among the mud and modest roofs. From it stepped Lady Henfield, a matronly acquaintance from London whose talent for cruelty was as refined as her lace. Aurelia's blood went cold. "My dear Lady Harbury," the woman cooed, using the title deliberately. "How splendid to find you, thriving." Her eyes flicked over the cottage with a smile of theatrical pity. "Such a charming exile. Tell me, how does one pass the hours without a ballroom to parade in?" Aurelia's breath caught. Her instinct was to summon Frost, to remind this woman that bloodlines could not be exiled. But before she could reply, Thomas appeared at the doorway, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Good afternoon," he said evenly. "May I help you, ma'am?" Lady Henfield blinked, startled that a man of plain dress dared interrupt her. "You may fetch your mistress, sir. I was speaking to her." "I heard," he said, voice calm but edged with steel. "You will speak to my wife with respect, or not at all." The silence that followed was exquisite. Henfield's cheeks reddened, her composure cracking for the briefest instant. She muttered something about rustic manners and retreated to her carriage, its wheels splattering mud as it fled down the lane. Aurelia stood frozen, unable to breathe. No one in her life, had ever shielded her without demand or design. When she found her voice, it was barely more than a whisper. "You had no right to do that." "Perhaps not," Thomas said, returning to his work. "But I had reason." "What reason?" He looked at her then, eyes steady, unashamed. "Because she was cruel. And because you deserve better." The world seemed to still around them. Wind stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of rain and wild thyme. Aurelia turned away quickly, but her pulse betrayed her. That night she placed the pressed flower from her windowsill inside his mother's recipe book, between honey cake and herb salve for the heart. She did not know why, only that it belonged there now. Outside, the rain began again, soft, persistent, patient. The kind that seeps through everything, even stone. Rain had begun before dawn, a soft, relentless sound that seemed to dissolve the distance between earth and sky. The cottage dimmed beneath it, blurred by mist, every surface breathing with quiet damp. Aurelia woke to the scent of wet wood and the low crackle of the hearth Thomas had kindled before she stirred. He moved about the room with unhurried grace, as though the storm had no power to intrude on his rhythm. Watching him through half-open eyes, she wondered, not for the first time, how a man so ordinary could make the air feel newly shaped around him. By mid-morning the downpour had deepened. The fields vanished behind a curtain of gray, the cottage reduced to a world of two. Aurelia sat by the window, mending a hem that needed no repair. She felt Thomas's presence like a quiet pulse. Each time he crossed the room, her needle trembled. When he spoke, it was practical, about the roof, the flooded path, but beneath his tone ran an ease she could not mirror. At last she said without looking up, "You speak as if the weather cannot touch you." "It does," he replied, setting down his tools. "But I've learned not to argue with what I can't change. You think me foolish for resisting it?" He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "No. Only human." The word struck her, so simple, yet no one in London had ever granted her the dignity of it. There she had been a symbol, a scandal, a caution. Human was something she had forgotten to be. When the fire burned low, Thomas brought another log. He crouched near the hearth, the light catching his hands, broad, scarred, and steady. "You needn't sew to fill the silence," he said quietly. "It doesn't ask to be mended." "I find silence dangerous," she answered. "Then perhaps it's what you need most." The challenge in his voice startled her. "And what makes you so certain of what I need?" He met her gaze then, and she saw no arrogance there, only a gentleness that refused to yield. "Because you look as I once did," he said. "Always braced for judgment that never stops coming." She stared at him, uncertain how to answer. "You presume much, Mr. Lynden." "I presume little," he said softly. "But I listen." The air thickened between them, not tense but fragile. For a moment she wanted to tell him everything. The betrayal, the letter, the faces that had turned away, but pride, that old armor, still held. Hours later, when the storm deepened, thunder cracked close enough to shake the windows. The horses in the small stable neighed in panic. Without hesitation, Thomas pulled on his coat. "Stay inside," he said. "I'll calm them." Instinct made her rise. "You'll be soaked through. I've weathered worse." He smiled, faint and crooked. "The beasts are easier to reason with than people." She almost smiled in return, then caught herself. When he stepped out into the downpour, the door swung shut with a gust that made the candlelight quiver. Through the window she watched him, dark figure against the rain, steadying the frightened animals with a calm hand. He moved as though the storm answered to him, his voice low, his patience unbreakable. Something within her, something she thought long extinguished, stirred with quiet ache. By the time he returned, drenched and shivering, she had warmed a towel by the fire. "You should change," she said, forcing indifference into her tone. He nodded, wringing water from his sleeves. "Yes, Your Grace." The title, spoken softly without mockery, made her freeze. It had been months since anyone had called her that. "Do not," she whispered. "I am no longer that woman." Thomas paused. "Then who are you?" The question landed like a stone in water, its ripples spreading through her. She had no answer. The woman she had been, the Duchess, the glittering perfection, was gone. The one she had become was still unmade. "I don't know," she said at last. He looked at her, and his voice gentled. "Then perhaps we'll find out." Later, as evening fell, the rain softened to a silver whisper. They shared supper by the fire, stew and bread, the humblest of meals. Thomas ate without ceremony, but his manners were not coarse. Every movement carried the quiet restraint of someone who understood dignity without needing to perform it. When he spoke again, his tone was distant, thoughtful. "You asked what I think of the world's cruelty. I think it was built by those who never had to beg forgiveness." "You sound almost bitter," she said. He looked into the fire. "Not bitter. Tired." The silence that followed was not dangerous this time. It was intimate. A kind of listening passed between them, wordless but deep. After a while, she found herself saying, "I wonder if my family ever thinks of me." "Do you want them to?" "No," she paused. "Yes." Her hands tightened around the cup she held. "I wanted them to defend me. Just once. To say, she would not do this. But they didn't." He nodded slowly. "Truth seldom stands a chance when pride takes the floor. You sound as though you've seen that before." He met her gaze, and in the flicker of the fire she saw it, the shadow behind his calm. "My father worked 30 years for men who called him loyal until they found it useful to call him expendable. When he died, they sent no letter, no coin. Only silence." The words hung between them like smoke. Without thinking, Aurelia reached across the table. Her fingertips brushed his hand, a light, accidental touch, but neither of them moved away. The contact lasted only a breath, yet it burned through her like a confession. "You never told me," she said quietly. "It changes nothing. It changes how I see you." He gave a faint smile. "Then you've seen too much." She wanted to protest, to tell him that seeing him clearly was the first honest thing she'd done in years, but something in his restraint held her back. Instead she said, "You never asked if I was guilty." "I didn't need to." Her throat tightened. "You believe me then?" "I always have." The simplicity of it undid her. She rose from the table and turned away, hiding her trembling hands against the window frame. Outside the rain had ceased. The world beyond was washed clean, glimmering with moonlight. "You should hate me," she said softly. "You were forced into this." "I don't believe in hating what I'm meant to understand," he replied. She turned back to him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "And what am I then?" His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "A woman learning how to live again." For a long moment neither spoke. The fire settled into embers and the room dimmed to gold and shadow. Something fragile, something forbidden, hovered in the air between them. Then Thomas rose, crossing to the door. "Come," he said gently. "The storm's gone. There's something I want to show you." He led her into the night. The earth glistened, the scent of rain still heavy, the sky clear enough to reveal a scatter of trembling stars. Behind the cottage, he stopped at a small patch of turned soil. "I cleared it for you," he said. "A garden. You needn't use it, but it's yours if you wish to make something grow." Aurelia looked down at the dark, glistening earth. The gesture was so simple, so undeserved, it struck her like grace. "Why?" she whispered. "Because everything deserves a chance to begin again," he said. Her breath caught. She knelt, pressing her palm to the soil, cool and alive. "Perhaps," she murmured almost to herself, "I may grow again too." He smiled faintly, turned to leave her with the stars and the earth and her quiet awakening. And as she watched him fade into the lamplight, she realized the strangest thing of all. She no longer felt punished. She felt alive. Spring unfolded quietly across the hills, as if the world itself had decided to forgive. The cottage, once foreign, began to feel inhabited, not just by two lonely souls but by something unspoken that lingered between them. The garden Thomas had cleared now shimmered with green shoots, each one a small defiance against the past. Aurelia rose early to tend it, her hands, once jeweled and untouchable, now stained with earth. When Thomas passed her in the mornings, his glance carried something tender, restrained, and unbearably patient. Yet for every inch she gained toward peace, a shadow followed. Letters from London began to arrive, their seals heavy with the Harbury crest. Thomas placed them on the table each time without comment, but Aurelia left them unopened. She could feel London breathing through the wax, its judgment, its perfume of hypocrisy. Finally, on a gray morning that smelled of rain and lilacs, she broke one open. "Lady Aurelia," it began coldly. "The false accusations against you have been retracted. The Lord Chancellor extends apology and restoration of your title. You may resume your rightful place among your peers immediately." Her heart should have lifted, but the words fell like stones. Rightful place. As though everything she had lived since her exile was an aberration to be erased. She folded the letter and stared out at the fields where Thomas was mending a fence. The distance between them had never felt wider. That evening she laid the letter before him. "It seems I have been forgiven," she said. He looked at the paper, then at her. "Forgiven for what?" "For existing beneath my own station, apparently." He studied her face quietly. "Will you go back?" The question pierced more deeply than she expected. "I don't know. It was my world." "And is it still?" Aurelia turned from him, unable to answer. The fire cracked softly between them, its warmth edged with tension. "You do not understand what it is to lose everything," she whispered. Thomas's voice was low but steady. "I understand exactly. I just learned to see what was left." She looked at him sharply, half wounded, half moved. "You speak as if happiness were a choice." "Not happiness," he said. "Grace." The word unsettled her. Grace, something undeserved, something given freely. She had never known it without condition. Days passed, and the distance between them grew not from anger, but fear. The villagers, now familiar, began to speak of her differently. The Duchess who helped mend roofs, who taught the children their letters, who laughed softly in the fields. Some called her redeemed. Others whispered that she would soon leave, return to her proper kind. She heard it all and found herself strangely torn between pride and longing. One afternoon, while pruning the roses, she felt Thomas's presence before she saw him. "You should wear gloves," he said. "The thorns will have you bleeding again." "I don't mind it," she replied. "It reminds me that I'm alive." He smiled faintly. "I suppose that's worth a little pain." When she turned to him, her eyes caught the faint scar that crossed his forearm. "How did that happen?" "Years ago. A horse frightened during a storm. My fault. I didn't let go soon enough." "You seem to have a habit of holding on too long," she said softly. His gaze met hers. "And you of letting go too soon." The air trembled with the nearness of something dangerous and beautiful. Then he stepped back, breaking the spell. "You'll have visitors soon," he said. "The letter will have reached them by now." Visitors? Someone will come to remind you where you belong. He was right. 2 days later, a polished carriage rolled up the lane, its wheels scattering petals from her garden. Lord Silton himself, a man of pale arrogance who had once sought her hand, stepped down, followed by a footman gleaming with London polish. "My dear Lady Harbury," Silton declared, sweeping a bow that reeked of self-satisfaction. "The entire city rejoices at your vindication. How cruelly you were wronged. But all is restored, and society waits to welcome you home." His gaze swept over the cottage with distaste. "Surely you cannot remain in such rustic confinement." Aurelia smiled thinly. "I have found peace here." "Peace?" He laughed lightly. "Come now. You were born to silk and candlelight, not mud and chores. I dare say this experiment has run its course." Thomas had emerged quietly from the barn, his shirt sleeves rolled, his expression unreadable. Silton followed her glance toward him and smirked. "Ah, the husband. How noble of him to endure such a fate. You've done your penance, my dear, let us be rid of it." Before Aurelia could speak, Thomas said evenly, "My lord, your concern is misplaced. My wife needs no rescue." Silton looked him over as one might a servant. "Your wife," he said slowly, tasting the words. "She will soon remember she was never truly yours." Aurelia's pulse thundered. "Enough," she said sharply. "You may leave." Silton blinked, surprised. "Aurelia." "Go," she repeated, her voice cutting through the air like glass. He bowed stiffly, anger flashing behind his charm, and retreated to his carriage. The wheels rattled down the lane, leaving silence in their wake. Aurelia turned to Thomas, but he was already gathering his tools. "He is right," he said quietly. "About what?" "You were never truly mine." The word struck harder than any insult could have. "Thomas?" He did not look up. "You were given to me as punishment. You owe me nothing. And now that you are free, you should take it." Her chest tightened. "You think freedom means leaving what you love?" He froze then, the hammer slipping from his hand. "Don't say what you don't mean." "I mean," she said, stepping closer, "that you are the only truth I've known since my life began again." He turned at last, and his eyes, so often gentle, were fierce with restraint. "You cannot build truth on pity. Do you believe that's what this is?" "I don't know what it is," he said, voice low. "But I cannot bear to keep you here if every day you wonder what you might have been." She shook her head, tears threatening. "You would cast me off to protect my pride, while I would give up everything to keep what is real." For a heartbeat they stood in silence, the garden blooming wildly around them, the air alive with scent and pain. Then Thomas whispered, "I love you, Aurelia. But love is not a chain. I will not hold you by it." She stepped closer, her breath trembling. "Then what will you hold me by?" His reply came almost brokenly. "By hope." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead she reached for him, her fingers brushing his jaw before rising to his lips in a trembling kiss, one that was both promise and farewell. When she drew back, she saw the same agony she felt mirrored in his eyes. He turned away, unable to speak, and she knew he was already withdrawing to spare them both. The next morning, a messenger arrived from London, bearing an invitation embossed in gold. The Duchess Aurelia Harbury is requested to attend the season's opening ball in her honor. She stared at it, her pulse unsteady. The parchment gleamed in the morning light, a door to the world she once thought she wanted. Behind her, through the open window, came the faint sound of Thomas's axe striking wood, steady, certain, unyielding. Aurelia pressed the letter to her chest, caught between two lives, and whispered into the quiet room, "I will choose my life tomorrow." London rose before her like a mirage built of smoke and gold. The carriage wheels clattered over cobblestones slick with rain, carrying Aurelia through streets she once ruled and now scarcely recognized. Every window glowed with light, every shadow whispered her name. The city she had been banished from had forgotten her suffering but remembered her scandal. Yet tonight it wished to celebrate her return. A ball in her honor, a spectacle of forgiveness. How quickly cruelty could be perfumed and called grace. Inside the mirrored ballroom of Lord Silton's estate, chandeliers burned as if determined to outshine heaven. Ladies in silk whispered behind jeweled fans, pretending delight while their eyes glittered with curiosity. Men bowed, all polished smiles and false contrition. Aurelia entered in a gown of pale ivory, the color of surrender or perhaps resurrection. The orchestra paused. Conversation faltered. For a single breathless moment, all London seemed to hold its breath. "Lady Harbury," murmured Silton as he approached, his tone smooth with practiced admiration. "How radiant you are. I dare say the countryside agrees with you." "It taught me humility," she said coolly, accepting his hand for a formal bow. "Though some lessons are best unlearned." He chuckled, unbothered. "The city missed you, my dear. We are poorer without your grace. Perhaps tonight will restore what was lost." Aurelia's gaze drifted to the crowd, to the faces that had once turned from her. Restoration, she thought bitterly, was a word for men who had never known ruin. Yet she smiled, the perfect Duchess once more, her poise sharper than any blade. As the waltz began, Silton leaned close. "You see? London remembers its favorites. You were always meant to return." Her reply was quiet but final. "No, my lord. I was meant to awaken." He frowned, uncertain whether to take offense. Before he could respond, Aurelia stepped away, the gown whispering around her like a sigh. She crossed the ballroom, past the perfume and pretense, until she reached the balcony. The cold air rushed to meet her, tasting of rain and freedom. Beyond the manicured gardens, the city stretched endlessly, glittering, magnificent, hollow. For a long moment she stood alone, staring down at the lights below. And in the silence she heard a sound that did not belong to London. The memory of an axe striking wood, steady and unyielding, somewhere far away in the country. It beat like a heart she could not silence. When she turned, a gentleman stood in the doorway, hesitant. "Lady Harbury," he said softly. "Forgive me, but is it true you have reconciled with the Chancellor? That you will rejoin society?" Aurelia's expression didn't change. "Rejoin?" she murmured. "Tell me, sir, how does one rejoin what never loved her?" He looked confused, bowed awkwardly, and retreated. The door closed, leaving her alone again. She exhaled, trembling. Her hands, steady even in exile, shook for the first time. Inside, the music swelled into a triumphant march. Glass clinked, laughter rose, and London's cruelty twirled in time with its violins. She had thought coming here would bring clarity, but all she felt was exhaustion, the weight of being adored for the mask she had once worn. "Your Grace," said a voice behind her. Her mother stood in the doorway, regal and frostbound. "You have redeemed yourself. At last our name is clean again." Aurelia turned slowly. "Is that what this is?" "It is survival," her mother replied. "And survival is all that matters for women of rank." Aurelia's throat tightened. "I have survived, mother. But I no longer wish to live like the dead." Her mother's eyes flickered with something like fear. "You speak like a dreamer." "No," Aurelia said softly. "I speak like someone awake." She moved past her mother without another word. Down the marble steps, through the watching crowd, past Silton's look of bewildered amusement. The hall seemed to hold its breath as the Duchess who had once begged for society's mercy walked instead toward the exit. A murmur followed her, disbelief, scandal, awe. Outside the night was colder, freer. The carriage waiting at the gate was hers to command, but her voice trembled when she spoke to the driver. "To Harbury Hill," she said. "No, further. To the Lynden farm." The driver blinked. "It is a long road, my lady." "Yes," she murmured, climbing in. "So was the way back to myself." Hours passed beneath a silvered sky. The wheels hummed their steady rhythm over the dark lanes. As dawn approached, the city gave way to open fields, mist curling like breath over the earth. When the first streak of sunlight broke, she saw it, the small cottage standing against the morning, smoke rising from its chimney as if it had been waiting. She stepped down before the carriage stopped. Mud clung to her hem, dew wet her shoes, but she did not care. The garden she had tended was alive again, wild, overflowing with blooms she had once planted in trembling hope. The scent of lavender and rain wrapped around her like a benediction. Thomas stood in the doorway as though drawn by the sound of her approach. He looked older somehow, though only weeks had passed, or perhaps he simply carried the stillness of someone who had stopped waiting. His shirt sleeves were rolled, his hands roughened with work. When he saw her, he froze, disbelief breaking across his features. "Aurelia," he breathed. She took a step forward, her voice trembling but sure. "Do not call me my lady. Not anymore." He shook his head slightly as though trying to wake from a dream. "You came back." "Yes." She smiled faintly. "You told me love was not a chain. But I have discovered it can be an anchor, something that keeps us from drifting into nothing." He did not move, afraid that a single breath might shatter her into mist. "You have your name again. Your place." "I had everything," she said, her eyes glistening. "And it was empty." You gave me nothing, and it became everything I could not live without. Silence expanded, alive and trembling. The morning light fell over them, gilding her hair, catching on the tears she did not try to hide. Thomas's voice broke the stillness, low and aching. Why would you return to a life so small? Because it holds a heart so large, she whispered. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, and when his hands found her face, it was not passion that consumed them, but recognition. The kiss they shared was not new but remembered, the completion of something long begun. When they drew apart, Aurelia rested her forehead against his. They sent you to humble me, she said softly. Instead you taught me love. He smiled then, quiet, disbelieving, luminous. And you taught me forgiveness. The dawn deepened around them. The fields shimmered gold, the sky blushed faintly with morning. Behind them, the cottage glowed like a promise kept. Aurelia stepped back, brushing a hand over the wild roses at the gate. Do you still believe everything deserves a chance to begin again? Thomas met her gaze. Now I know it. She took his hand. Then let us begin. And as the sun lifted, the world seemed to exhale, the rain-washed fields alive with light, the air fragrant with new beginnings. The Duchess who had been cast out for pride stood beside the man chosen to humble her, and together they made something holier than redemption, peace. The camera of memory would have ended there, 2 figures framed against gold, the earth reborn. But as the wind stirred through the blooming garden, a final thought lingered, whispered like prayer. The world punished her to break her pride. Instead, it taught her that love is the only nobility that cannot be taken away. And if you listen closely, perhaps you can still hear it, the sound of a woman who was once a duchess, laughing softly as the morning sun catches her ring, no longer gold of status but gold of promise. A reminder that some exiles lead not to ruin but to home.